Hi, welcome to the Newberry Chronicles. I'm Michael.
And I'm Rebecca.
And this is a podcast where two readers go through every Newberry Medal winning book and then talk about them, sometimes at great length. This time, we're going to be talking about 1977's medal winner, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which is written by Mildred D. Taylor, but I'm looking at her middle name and I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's a cool looking last name.
Yeah.
Middle name.
Yeah, so Mildred D. Taylor, not to be confused with Mildred F. Taylor.
Who's that?
It says, for the American politician from New York, see Mildred F. Taylor.
Boo, I say boo American politicians from New York. Very few good ones.
So Mildred Taylor was born on September 13th, 1943, so she just turned 79. She's still living today. She was born in Jackson, Mississippi. She was the great-granddaughter of a former slave who was the son of an African Native American woman, and a white landowner. She moved to Toledo as a child and graduated from the University of Toledo in 1965. After that, she spent 2 years with the Peace Corps in Ethiopia. She later earned her master's in journalism at the University of Colorado, where she created a Black Studies program as a member of the Black Student Alliance, and she still lives in Colorado today. So Mildred Taylor is famous for all of the children's books that she wrote about the Logan family. Her most popular is Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which we're obviously talking about today. These books are semi-autobiographical. They are about... So a little bit about her past, which she was born in Mississippi, and her great-grandparents bought land in Mississippi at the turn of the century. Her father and his siblings all grew up in this family home, and they later moved away, but every single year they would bring back their children, and she was one of those children. So Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and all the books about the Logan family, they span from slavery to the Jim Crow South. And they are based on oral history that was told to Mildred by her father and her uncles and her aunt. And I'll talk a little bit more about how she came to finish Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. But all of her contributions to children's literature and specifically writing about the Logan family, because of all of that, she was awarded the NSK, I think you pronounce it Neustadt Prize for Children's Literature in 2003. So when she wrote Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, which Michael will give that synopsis in a little bit, she was actually editing for a tax firm, and she would write in the evenings and on the weekends. She was living in LA at that time, and she had 2 chapters left to write, and she just felt really stuck. She had to come back to Toledo to take care of her parents. Her dad was ill, and there were some other things going on with her mom. So she came back, and she was actually doing laundry in the basement, was the thing that she says in her foreword. And this song came to her, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. What are you doing?
I was just grabbing the book because I wanted to look at something, but...
Oh, I was going to read the lyrics of the song.
I'm sorry. This is a very poor time for me to grab the book to look up something. Yes. I'm sorry.
Yes. So anyway, I should have had it turned to that.
I've thrown Rebecca off, but I promise you that she is more well-prepared than I am for this book.
But anyway, so these lyrics came to her. And their roll of thunder, hear my cry, over the water, by and by. Old man coming down the line, whip in hand, to beat me down, but I ain't gonna let him turn me round. So this song came to her, and when that song came to her, she knew how she needed to finish the book. She also told her father that when that song came to her, she had the vision that she just knew that she was going to win the Newbery Medal by writing this book. And her father didn't even know what that award was. And so when she told him about it, he was just so happy, thought that would be so nice. Why are you laughing?
Because it's funny to me. It's like
That's real nice, honey.
Dad, I'm going to win this amazing, prestigious
No.
award for children's literature. He's like, oh, good for you,
I
honey.
think it's sweet. It's very sweet. And what is sad is her dad did not live to see her finish this book or win the medal. But he died 8 months after they had that conversation. 6 months after that, this book was published. And then 4 months later, she won the medal. So, anyway, that's just a little bit about Mildred Taylor. But now you can have the book back to look up what you were going to look
Oh, thank you. I don't know if I'm going to look it up now because I now have to give the plot summary to this book, which is going to be like intellectually taxing because of all the books that we've read so far in this podcast. I think it's fair to say that this has the most complicated plot, which is not really a bad thing, but there's a lot going on here, and so I'm probably going to have to use all my like mental energy to make sure that I get all this straight. So and it all makes sense to readers. But honestly, if you haven't read the book, it might be a little bit jumbled because it's one of these books where there's all sorts of different parallel plot lines, and at first it kind of is like almost episodic, and then they all converge at the climax, and so all these like episodic things build up to what eventually happens. So it makes it kind of hard to summarize because a lot of the stuff is scattered at first, but I'll do my best. So like Rebecca said, this is kind of semi based on Mildred Taylor's family's history. And as Rebecca said, that her family actually owned land in the Jim Crow South, which was obviously unusual at the time. And so the Logan family that this focuses on, they own some land, right? And so our protagonist is Cassie, who is, I think, 9 years old. Yeah, she's 9 years old, and she's Cassie Logan. So she's one of 4 kids in the Logan family. There's her older brother, Stacy, and then there's Christopher John, her younger brother, and then her other little brother, Little Man. I don't know, does he have an actual name besides Little Man?
I don't think so. Well,
I hope that's actually his first
but
and middle name is
we
Little
don't
and
usually
Man.
hear him say that. But her great uncle actually went by Little Man. That's what they called him. So
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. So, at any rate, so it mostly focuses on Cassie's experiences when she's 9, like over the course of several months. It seems like as her family, who has land, is starting to face financial hardships that might cause them to lose the land. And this is important because the land used to belong to the Grangers, who in the antebellum South were slave owners, and this was a plantation. But after Reconstruction, I don't remember the reason, but the Logan family is able to buy a small parcel of the plantation and actually own the land. And so that's been like a thorn in the side of the Granger family for now like a couple generations. And so they're always trying to get this land back. And the Logan family obviously wants to hold on to the land because it's their only source of wealth. They are farmers, and specifically cotton farmers, I think, right? That's their only crop, is cotton. And so they have to keep the land because it's their livelihood. And in fact, it is a small enough piece of land that actually the dad has to go on the off season and work for the railroads. And so Cassie's dad is kind of in and out of the story because he's oftentimes leaving to go work on the railroad again when there's not like stuff to be done actively on the farm so that they can continue to have income. But the plot kind of focuses on Cassie's experiences, like I mentioned, when she's 9. Another thing to know is that her mom is a school teacher for the local black school, like, most of the South at this time, like this rural Mississippi community is segregated on all strata of society, but especially with schools. And so there's the very nice and very like on the nose named Jefferson Davis High School, which is the white kids' school, and then there is the black school where her mom teaches, which doesn't get good resources, and in fact gives hand-me-down resources from the Jefferson Davis School, and those resources are like racist and not giving good history because it's of course coming from Jefferson Davis,
and are also in such poor condition that they say in the front of the books that they are poor condition, so it goes to the Negro children.
Right, like these are only hand-me-downs because the white kids are done with them, and then even when they do get them, they're not like amazing textbooks anyway, and the mom has to like tell the real history that's not like glorifying the Confederate South and justifying slavery and all this sort of stuff. Um, in addition to the Logan kids, there's another kid who goes to their school whose name is TJ, who comes from a family that does not own property. And most of the other black characters in this book do not own property. They're mostly sharecroppers who are sharecropping for one of the major white landowning families in the area. And so TJ is coming from a less financially secure and just kind of less stable household in general, and so he kind of gets into scrapes and is a little bit more like of a like live wire, and he starts having trouble at school because he's failing tests and stuff, and he is friends with Stacy, and he keeps trying to get Stacy to get his mom's answers so that TJ can cheat and pass his tests. But Stacy will not do that. And so this is like an escalating conflict that happens. And eventually, what happens is that TJ basically gets kicked out of school because he's caught cheating. And it's more complicated than that, but that's like basically the gist of it. And so you have that thread with TJ. Simultaneously, and again, I'm sorry, this is jumbled, but you simultaneously have the Logan family talking with this nice white lawyer who is sympathetic to the black cause at this time, and this lawyer's name is Mr. Jameson, and he is trying to help them legally secure their property so it won't be unjustly taken by the Grangers.
When the grandmother dies, right?
Right, yeah, because they need to be sure that ownership of the property passes through the family line rather than being put up for auction or nefarious ways of like snatching it out from under them. At the same time, there is also another family called the Sims, and they are a white family, not as powerful as like let's say the Grangers or the Wallaces are another white family who owns the local store. And the Sims go to Jefferson Davis School. Is it a one-room schoolhouse? Like I want to say Jefferson Davis High School, but it's not a high school we're talking about.
No, and none of them are one-room schoolhouses because they have different classrooms.
Do they? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they have different teachers.
Okay. Well, regardless, the Sims go to the local white school, but one of the kids, whose name is Jeremy, is like he's nice, right? And so he starts to befriend the Logan kids because they kind of walk the same path to go to school, even though they go to different schools. They kind of share a path for a while, and so Jeremy starts to being able to fill in the Logan kids about like what some of the white families are saying about the black families, and again at the same time, like I said, lots of parallel plots. The local black families who are sharecropping are starting to have an increasing financial strain because, as is the case with sharecropping, turns out it's kind of a scam. You can never get out from debt from the person that you're working for, right? Because you're loaned all this money by the landowner to get the seed and get the tools and stuff to grow your crop, and then you have to give them a portion of your crop back. But also, it's kind of like a company town situation where the white landowners also own the local store, the Wallace's store, and they are driving up prices so that they can get the rest of the black people's money that they don't already get from collecting their loans from the sharecropping families. And so the Wallaces, who are one of the other landowning families, own the local general store and are really squeezing financially the sharecropping families. And so Cassie's mom, Mrs. Logan, begins to do a boycott of the general store where she's driving to the next town over to get groceries at the non-exploitative rate and then bringing them back to the families to sell.
But what really motivated them to do that boycott was not just their injustice of how they're treating the black families, but because they had burned that one family's land and that, remember? that is
Yes.
kind of the inciting incident, that there's basically an attempted murder of a
Right.
black family because they were falsely accused of something. And so they're not only powerful, but they're
These guys are
they're
like in the
inciting
KKK and
they're
stuff.
inciting
Like,
violence. And
right.
yeah, so that's just an important
Yeah, and there's so
plot
many
point.
details that I'm having to skate over because again, like there's a lot going on. And so I'm explaining all these like the most significant parallel stories because here's what ends up happening by the end of the story is this. When TJ gets kicked out of school, he falls in socially with Jeremy Sims's older brothers, who are like basically doing the whole like middle school thing where you'll pretend to be friends with somebody, but then behind your back you're like kind of chuckling like how much they dislike you and how much they're able to manipulate you and stuff like that. But TJ thinks that like, oh, the black families I was with have kicked me out of their school, but these white families are welcoming me. Um, and eventually, TJ and these other kids who are kind of up to no good decide to rob a store because the store has like a gun that they want to go to use. And so, in the process of robbing the store, the store owners get killed, and it's a little ambiguous like how they get killed. But regardless, they get killed, and of course, it's TJ who gets the blame for this because he's black and they've killed a white, a white store owner, and the white kids don't really get the heat for any of this. And so the white families, this is like the match that lights the powder keg, right? Because there's already all these tensions because there's the boycott going on. There is the Grangers who want the property back from the Logans. There is all sorts of stuff. Oh, I have also forgotten. When TJ gets kicked out of school, he goes and gets the Wallaces after he's friends with the Sims, so he has some ins with the white folks. He goes and gets them to get Cassie's mom, Mrs. Logan, fired from her job, so that puts increasing financial pressure on the Logans. So that's going on as well. And so there's the boycott. There's all these things that have increased the tensions among like the wealthy former plantation owners, current sharecropping owner. They're not sharecropping, but like uh, landowners, and the sharecropping families plus the Logans, who are kind of like the financial anchor of the black community. Um, and when TJ is involved in this robbery that results in the deaths of the white family, this causes all hell to break loose, and the whites become intent on a lynching. Right, they're going to go kill TJ because in their eyes, this is like the black people are getting out of line. We have to put them in their place, and now we've been given the kind of barest framework of legal justification to basically institute a terrorist attack. So you have like the Ku Klux Klan gets involved, which has already been involved, but like they're like actively involved in they're about to kill this poor kid who's like 12 or 13, and in order to stop the lynching, you have like Mr. Jameson who is kind of trying to stop them from doing that, but he's unsuccessful at doing that because there's just one of him, and so Mr. Logan, Cassie's dad, ends up setting his own crops on fire because he knows that because it's adjacent land to the Grangers, that his crops being on fire are a danger to their crops. And so they have to all act as a community to put out the fire. And in the subsequent delay of the lynching, they're able to kind of like whisk TJ away and have him like held in a jail cell rather than like being, held by a vigilante mob. And by the end of the book, it's implied that like he's either going to be in jail for life or he's going to be lynched at a later time when they can get him in jail. So that's kind of how the book ends. And I have spent a long time summarizing this book and have not hit everything, but that's like the basic gist of the arc of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sorry at how long and jumbled that was, but there's a lot going on in this book.
Yeah.
Rebecca, what'd you like about this book?
I liked a lot of things about this book. I don't know that we mentioned this is our first time that both of us of reading this book. I was familiar with it, because it's very popular.
It's really commonly assigned in schools.
Yeah.
I remember that at least.
Yeah, but I just had never read it. So I really I was really glad that this book included the original foreword that Mildred Taylor wrote when this was first published, so you get to hear her story. And then in the copy that we read, there's also a letter that she wrote afterwards, kind of explaining who inspired which characters, and there's like pictures of her family and
Yeah,
those
it's
sort
actually
of
kind of
things.
cool.
Yeah, and it put a lot of it in perspective. So what I really liked, the reason why I mentioned that is there is so much power in telling your own narrative, especially in a situation like this where written history or records would have been unreliable. Um, she's the great granddaughter of slaves. Those birth histories, those birthdays, those records are not going to be reliable. So she's taking the stories of her great grandparents and her grandfather and her parents and aunts and uncles and weaving this beautiful story of the Logans. And she had this beautiful quote in her forward where she said, "I began to visualize all the family who had once known the land, and I felt as if I knew them too." So I just think there's so much power in that, in telling your own story and the story of your family and giving them life that then um, can inspire and educate so many others. So I
I
just
will
loved
say,
that autobiographical piece of it.
to jump in, there are scenes in this book in which the adults are doing the same for Cassie. Like,
Right.
you get like chapters in this book where the mom or the grandmother is saying like, here's our family history, or here's the history of like this surrounding neighborhood, and like that like, scene in which they get the white people's textbooks and see all these like, woefully inaccurate
Mm-hmm.
summaries of like the like history of the area, or just the history of the United States. Like, it's like you're saying, it's a counterpoint, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
the history as told
Mm-hmm.
by the people in power is not reliable, and so you have oral history that fills in like what is left out.
Which is something that is so relevant to right now when we're talking about what is taught in school, like arguments that are happening over textbooks, especially for history, but also with literature. I mean, like if you're paying attention at all, this is a hot topic right now, and it's so important. And I've heard so many of my Black friends say there's what we learned in school and then there's what we learned at home. And so I just think this book is so relevant um, to every single generation. And what I really appreciate about this book is it is written by a Black woman in her perspective and in the perspective of her family, where the stories of white people are not centered, and that race relations are not, I mean, whitewashed. There's many layers to that term, but um, they, I just, they're nuanced, don't get me wrong, but they don't boil down to what you so often read in books where in slavery or in the Jim Crow South, there are good white people and there are bad white people, and their stories are centered. And everything kind of revolves around that. And I think that this is important uh, for so many people, but I'm just speaking as a white woman. It's important for me to read these stories. One, because I, you know, racism is not something that is so far removed from where we are now. I think when those white stories are centered and it's here's the good white people and here's the bad white people, it's easy to find yourself as a good white person and not to really grapple with the complexities of race relations. And I think it's so important. So I think that she does that really well. Two characters in particular where I think we really see this happen, which you mentioned this in your plot summary, but Jeremy Sims, he clearly likes the Logans and he dislikes his family. He is an outcast in his family. I want to say that he is beaten if they find out that he associates with them. Like there's one scene in which he comes to the Logans' home and the dad's like, "Does your dad know you're here?" And he's like, "No." He's like, "Well, then you should go home, shouldn't you?" And there is definitely like he clearly wants to align himself with the Logans, but he can never fully do that. And those boundaries are just so clearly drawn. And I think this is something, like, as a white child, it can be hard to understand as a white person in general, but especially in the heart of a child. But something that, I've definitely had to learn is that being kind does not necessarily earn you a seat at the table, that trust has to be built, and you might never fully be included into a particular circle. And that doesn't make someone else racist. It's a means of protection, and it's a response to years of racism and discrimination. And I think another place that we see this is in the relationship with Mr. Jameson, their family lawyer. He's clearly an ally. That's clear throughout the book, but that relationship is always purely professional, and you can tell that it always will be.
Right. Although he does help with to save TJ.
Right. He does help. That's what I mean. But it's here's what he's there to do, and he's gonna fight what's right. But he's
there are definitely times in which, like, he knows where the boundaries of where it's acceptable for him to do what he's doing for white people, and he doesn't cross those boundaries either. Like, he'll say, like, well, this is bad, like, this thing is happening, but I don't know what I can do.
And the Logans trust him, but not fully. Like, he's not in their inner circle. They understand at the end of the day, this is a powerful white man who is an ally to us and is helping us, but that's kind of where it stops. Like, he's not going to be there for Thanksgiving, at their table.
Right. And in a way he can't, because because it's a segregated society, and specifically a segregated society that is enforced by white terrorism. Like, for him to become, like, socially involved with black families would mean for him to lose his seat of power. Like, he could no longer be a ally in a seat of power if he is to become like that as well. Like, that's, like, I think another, like, small thread in the book, but is, like, in a segregated society in which, like, there's, like, punitive action taken, not just against the black families, but against, like, the people who would help black families. That is a way of reinforcing segregation, reinforcing these kind of, like, norms of you cannot trust, or there are barriers to there being just kind of like casual social threads.
Right. And this black community understands that deeply. We also see that happen with TJ. And so he is befriending these powerful white boys. And, the whole community is, I not only don't trust TJ, I especially don't trust him when he is a friend with these white boys. And so what we find out is that when they need a scapegoat, TJ is going to be that. And everyone else wants to distance themselves from that. And so I think that is not a story I have read often, and that happens time and time and time again. So I just appreciated that that we're hearing Mildred's voice in this. And I just think it's nice. I don't know, nice is the wrong word, because this book is very grim, but it's important, and I think it's true, to read a book where white and black people are not shown to be one big happy family as long as the racists aren't there. And I think that stories do this often to make white people feel better about how things could be, or giving them this false sense of reality about what race relationships look like today and why. And I think another person that does this really well is Angie Thompson in The Hate You Give. Thomas, I got it wrong, I'm sorry. I think she does that really well in that book as well, showing that dynamic. So some other things that I liked, I really liked the dialogue. I enjoyed seeing the camaraderie of the family, and just this sense of self-respect that the Logans instill in their children. So we talked about the books, the textbooks. One of the very initial scenes is that little man realizes that he's so excited to have a book, like have a textbook that he can take home and use in school. And he gets this book, and he realizes that the only reason he has it is because it's in really poor condition, and that's why he can have it as a black child. And he's just outraged by this, does not want the book, is punished because he doesn't want the book. But it like you can tell that their parents have just really instilled in them this strong sense of worth and self-respect, and I I really liked that. Um, I also really like the scene between Cassie and Lillian Jean. So Lillian Jean Sims is Jeremy's sister. Jeremy is the one that wants to be their friend, wants to walk with them. Lillian Jean. Uh, there is a scene in which Cassie does not move off the sidewalk, or she bumps Lillian Jean or something. I think they bump into each other. Cassie's asked to apologize. She doesn't. She's humiliated by Lillian Jean's father, really put in her place as a black girl. And so, to get her revenge against Lillian Jean for that whole incident, is she befriends her by just really being very really just um I'm losing my
She's
words.
like she pretends to be her friend so that she can learn
Right.
intimate details
But
about Lillian Jean,
she's
and then
very
she blackmails her.
subservient. She calls her Ms. Lillian Jean. So she learns. Yeah, you just told the end of it. I was just trying
Oh,
to
I'm
think.
sorry.
That's okay. So anyway, I think that scene is really good because Lillian Jean is so confused at how Cassie could have been so nice to her. She says, "You were just such a nice girl," and Cassie's so confused as, "How did you fall for that trick?" And I think that whole scene really just shows what can happen when you think that you are just centered in someone else's life fully, and that you're not entitled to their trust. So I
Or
think
you like
that
internalize social
yes.
norms, right?
Mhm.
Like, so for Lillian
Mhm.
Jean, it's a norm for black people to be subservient to her and to be deferential to her. And so she perceives that as just like niceness. That is like common courtesy, is that a black person would be deferential to me. Whereas like Cassie, like to her, that is abnormal because she's not used to doing that because she's not around white people because it's a segregated society, and to her it is degrading, which it is. I mean,
Mhm.
it is. Like, I mean, I think from a modern perspective, like it's like super degrading, and um, but I just think that it's interesting that like she can't. I'm sorry, I'm kind of co-opting what you
It's
said
okay.
or what you're saying, but she like lacks the social perspective to understand like why it would even be demeaning to Cassie. Like, it's almost just like she just views this as like the natural way things are and has no like ability to step out of that normalized
Mhm.
racism.
Yeah. And so this book is hard to read. It's really grim, especially the ending. And then I was finishing it late at night, so at the end of the book, Cassie is like staying up late to see what happens to TJ, and Stacy, her brother, is there and just a big string of events that would be a long thing to get into. She's worried about not only safety of TJ, but what's going to happen to her brother. So she's like trying to stay up late, figure out what's happening. It gets into the morning. So I felt like I was like weary with her, like we got to find out what happens. But I think that scene is done really well, and I just like seeing that scene that there's almost a lynching that is happens before you. I've never read a lynching scene written like that, and you can see how fear and this desire for law and order can lead to murder. And I don't it's not just the KKK picking random black people to terrorize, and I'm not saying that didn't happen, but this scene just reminds you that we're not removed from this type of violence that can happen when those in power believe that they're superior and someone else's existence is a threat to their comfort and security. It leads to the self-righteous violence. And when I was reading that, I just was thinking about George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, and people are still defending George Zimmerman. Like, we're not all on the same page about what happened there, and he's making money off of murdering a child. And so I think reading
But he
this,
also felt like,
he felt threatened.
yeah, the feeling of being threatened, because of all these kind of like internalized ways that
Mhm.
we are like conditioned to feel about like cross racial encounters.
Yeah. So that's that's what I liked.
Good. I
Yeah.
liked a lot of those same things, but so I'm not gonna like repeat everything
Mm-hmm.
that you said. But one, like, I really like this, and this is gonna sound like backhanded, um, but this book reads like contemporary YA literature, but like without the things I don't like about contemporary YA literature. So like
There's no love
there's no
triangles.
love there's no love there's no like shoehorned in love triangle because she's 9 years old, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
there's no reason to have that. And like it's not that like love stories can be bad or whatever, but like when you there's been kind of like this wave in the last maybe 10 years or so of like really socially conscious YA books. Like you mentioned The Hate You Give, and there's other books like that too. And those are good and valuable for their own, on their own terms. But like they are also still very beholden to the tropes of YA literature. Like that's one of the ways in which, you kind of have to play the game because it is such a tropey publishing and like niche of the publishing industry. And I'm not saying that like children's literature like for younger kids isn't the same, but like this is kind of like published in like the late 70s when like what would become YA is only just beginning to bubble up. And so it doesn't have a lot of those same like, oh man, well here's the moment in which her boyfriend's going to do something and she's going to feel betrayed, and oh here's the moment when they're going to reconcile right before the climax, and like, it's not just boyfriend and girlfriend, but it's also like the specific like tropes of language, right? Like we have Cassie, who's our first person narrator, but she's also not like a first person narrator like you often hear in like contemporary children's literature. Like she's not like uh she doesn't have like attitude, she doesn't have like a kind of ironic distance or like a lot of those things that are really, she's not like telling jokes and stuff like, and it's not like those things are bad, but it's also like presenting things in a sophisticated way that doesn't condescend to your audience. Like people kind of like, one of the things people like about YA is it doesn't condescend to teens or whatever, which is true, but it's also doing those without like, I don't know, I guess like my personal pet peeves about like the like genre. And I think that that's cool. One of the things that I was talking to Rebecca about before we recorded this is that this, in a lot of ways, reminds me of To Kill a Mockingbird, and it is in some ways like a foil to that book because they're both set in the 1930s in the Jim Crow South in a fairly rural or small town environment. They both feature young girls who like feel like they're about the same age. I don't know how old Scout's supposed to be in To Kill a Mockingbird, but and they're both having like a kind of loss of innocence moment. Um, and in that same way that like To Kill a Mockingbird doesn't really condescend to like the perspective of someone who is that young, like they treat that being that young and honestly being naive, they don't treat that with disdain or like ironic distance. Like it is like a truly sincere like coming of age and coming to realize that the world is awful in a lot of ways. Like that is like the lesson of this, and I think people sometimes forget that the lesson of To Kill a Mockingbird is Scout learns that her dad's valiant fight to save a black man is doomed to fail because her society is irreparably ugly. Like that is a big part of To Kill a Mockingbird too. But I think also like in some ways this book feels fresher than To Kill a Mockingbird can sometimes be, just because of it being actually centered on black experiences. To Kill a Mockingbird is not really about black people, even though that's kind of like the central plot. It's about a white family, and I'm not saying that there's not value in that, but I mean this definitely does things that To Kill a Mockingbird wouldn't really dare to do, like to to like present like the lynching of a child, like To Kill a Mockingbird ends with a black person being actually killed, which is obviously really traumatizing. But like this is, I think, in a lot of ways, a lot more clear-eyed in
Mm-hmm.
depicting like the way that racialized violence is indiscriminate. Like
Mm-hmm.
Emmett Till and that sort of thing kind of comes to mind.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
and I think also, and I'm gonna kind of move away from the To Kill a Mockingbird book after this, like comparison after this point. But To Kill a Mockingbird is very much like in that mode that you were talking about, Rebecca, of like there's good white people and bad white people, and I think the book is more complicated than just that dichotomy. But the book definitely like flirts with that dichotomy. So you have
Right.
like Atticus is like the good, noble white person, and then you have like the I don't remember the name of the family, but they're the father rapes the daughter,
The
and then
Yules.
the Yules, yeah, thank you. The father rapes the daughter, and the black guy takes the fall. Um, like you have that, and it's also very class based, right? Because Atticus is a lawyer, and they are nice, and they have a maid, and then the Yules are like poor white trash, and there's like the implication that like sophistication and moral superiority kind of falls a little bit along those class lines. And again, it's more complicated than that. That said, this book I think has a much more nuanced sense of like how economics play into like your kind of social behavior, and the book's honestly like a little didactic about it at times, and maybe we can get to this in like the dislikes. But like the thing that I do like is this book is very conscious of the way that like race and economic class intertwine, and like the fact that like all of the conflict or much of the conflict in this book is not just centered around like racial resentment, but is also specifically centered around the ownership of property, like feels really important and really savvy. And also like the way that when the mother is like telling like the revised history, that's not in their textbooks, she grounds a lot of the slavery in the language of economics, like why slavery existed and how racism was born out of like this kind of like economic hierarchy that was created through slavery. And I think that that's really interesting and nuanced in a way that is like very rare to see in books about racism, is like this explicit like talk of the intertwining of economics with it. And I think that's cool. I think also just on just like less of a thematic level, but like more of just a kind of craft, like it's really fun and engaging to encounter a children's book that is this complex, like on plot level. And I mean, I think that it's a nice change of pace, right? A lot of children's literature is justifiably, and it's fine for children's literature to be fairly simple in terms of like what happens, because you're writing for people who are still learning how the world works. But this book is not simple at all. Like this book is like has the complexity of a book that you would be geared toward adults. And I do think that this is like, there's an interesting thing in children's literature is that quote unquote children's literature can be for a person who is 6 years old, or it can be for a person who is 13 years old, right? And there's a big difference cognitively, and just kind of like understanding of the world with this. And this is definitely for like older children, but at the same time, like it is still like laudably complex for like being like quote unquote like just children's literature. I'm not like, I mean, there's a lot of really great children's literature, but they don't usually aspire to be this like narratively intricate, and this is very narratively intricate, and I like that.
And there's also this is a complaint that we've had about a few of the books we've read so far. I don't feel like there's any loose ends of this plot. Like everything that you're given is resolved, not necessarily resolved, but you understand why she's going in a certain direction. They all
eventually have a purpose that ties in.
So while there are so many different things going on at once, and you're reading this from the perspective of a 9-year-old, like she has her characters tell their story well, I think.
Yeah, and it's very satisfying in that way, like when you get to the end of the book, like as like really awful and depressing and just brutal the end of the book is, which it is. Like it is not a happy ending at all. Like that's another thing too. You very rarely see, or at least I very rarely see children's literature that ends like with almost zero uplift. Like there is, the only uplift is that he didn't get lynched, but the crops are burned, and the guy's in jail, TJ's in jail, and will probably stay there for the rest of his life.
And
like
he'll probably be legally.
He'll probably be murdered by the state, instead of murdered by vigilantes.
Right.
So, like, as nauseating as it is to see those pieces falling into place, to see like there is no good ending possible in this, like that kind of becomes apparent before the end of the book. It's like a tragedy in that sense. At the same time, it is very dramatically satisfying, like as a reader, to see those things like fall into place, and for you to be like, oh, this is why we spent so much time with this character,
right.
or oh, this is why they talked about that earlier in the book. Like it really pays off, that sort of stuff that is very fun. Like fun not in the sense of like what is happening, but fun in the sense of, as a reader, it is rewarding, just on a technical level.
Yeah.
So anyway, I mean, we could keep talking about like what we like about this book, because I think it's obvious both you and I really like it. Yeah. But we've also been doing this podcast for 45 minutes now, so maybe we need to pivot.
I
Was there anything you didn't like about this
I
book?
don't really have any critiques of this book. There is something I would like more of, but it's not that kind of book. Like I wish that I could have seen more character development, but this is not that kind of book. Like you mentioned To Kill a Mockingbird, you do see Scout's character really develop in that. But this book has so much going on. It's not too much. Like it all works very well together, but it's not a book where you're going to see a lot of character development. It's very plot heavy, which again, not really a critique of the book, just something I enjoy in books. But I will say she wrote several books about this whole family, so you probably get that, in more books. And I do, I'm eager to read more about the Logan family and in her other novels, because I think she's a really good author. But that's really the only. I don't even think you can call that a dislike, but only, yeah.
Yeah, I think like for me, it's kind of something similar, and in a way, this is like an unfair critique because it's not the book it's trying to be, but like this is very much like like a book of social realism, and like almost like Stephen Crane or Jack London or that sort of thing, where there is
Right.
like a um, very naturalist, very like literal like relationship to like physical reality and like kind of social reality as well. And it is like the point of this book is very clear, and there's a very like well defined like, I mean, if you want to call it thesis, sounds too academic for what this book is, but you read it and you understand like what the point is, like what it's trying to teach you about society. And as Rebecca and I have both talked about, we think that that's like really valuable, like what it does. But at the same time, again, this is not in the book. It's not trying like that's what it's trying to be, and it achieves that. But if I'm talking about like my personal preference, like I do enjoy a little bit more like lyricism in books, and like I think about like this is not a 100% fair comparison because again these authors are doing completely different things, but if I think about like other books about race and race relations that I consider like really um, important and like meaningful, um, a lot of them, the ones that I've personally gravitated toward, have like some sort of element of like unknown or element of profundity to them that like I think this book never aspires to. So like if you think about, again, it's not really fair. This is not trying to be magical realist or anything like that, like this is. But if you think of like the work of Toni Morrison hits a lot of these same ideas while also having this sense of like wonder and like mystery in the book that like this book never aspires to. And just as a personal preference as a reader, there is a there is a kind of like ceiling on how much I enjoy a book that is like purely like social realism
Hmm.
and that doesn't get into these kind of like more ineffable or sublime elements of like the human experience. And again, this book doesn't aspire to be that, and so it's a little bit unfair to say that like, well, this is something that's wrong with the book.
Right.
But as a reader,
It's just personal
it's
preference.
yeah, it's right. Like this feels very much like if you read like I don't know if you had to read these, Rebecca, in like your AP literature classes or whatever, but like when we talk about like social realism in like the late 19th century, which is like Stephen Crane and stuff, and it's like books that are like very like dedicated to showing you like this is how a strata of society lives,
Hmm.
and they're like almost educational. This is kind of in that tradition,
Hmm.
and I don't think that that's a bad thing, but it's not always my like favorite
Right.
mode of literature.
Right. Yeah.
That said, this is like a really good version of that.
And
And
a version that I cannot iterate this enough, but it's just a version that as a white person I have not heard enough of.
yeah, and I will say like I don't remember if I've mentioned this on the podcast or not, and I don't even know if we have podcast listeners who are not like personally friends or family with us. So like maybe this is just redundant for listeners, but like so I teach high school English and in a public high school in Tennessee, and I this is the sort of book that would be tricky
Hmm.
to teach in a public high school in Tennessee. And it's not that it's not done. Like this is a really commonly assigned book. Like that's why I knew that this book existed, is because I had like I had never been assigned it myself, but I was aware that like, oh, this is like one of those. It's kind of like a book we'll probably read later on in this podcast, like Johnny Tremaine or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. It's one of those that kind of like circulates to the kind of like upper elementary or like middle school curriculum. Um, but like especially recently, it's become very like Tennessee has become a real hostile environment in public schools for openly talking about race, and they'll say like you can still talk about race, but then they'll put stipulations on it.
You have to present both
You
sides.
have to present both sides. You can't present like you can't talk about privilege. You can't talk about that the United States has like written into its laws like at the beginning like things that were racist. Like you can't, or if you do talk about those things, you can't get into them with a lot of detail. And like specifically in 2021, uh, like basically in response to a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, there was a pretty reactionary bill that passed in the state of Tennessee that like limited the discussion of oppression, like oppressed groups, in a public school setting. And those would you know you can read these characteristics and think like, well, I would never teach something like that. But what's you know like for instance, an individual's moral character is determined by an individual's race or sex. Like I don't think many teachers, if any teachers, are going and being like, I'm going to make these kids know that white people are bad. But what's happened is that as a result of this law being passed, it's opened the door for people to make complaints and allegations against teachers uh, because the stories that they tell are perceived as having said white people are bad. So like a really early complaint once this law was passed was that was against a biography of Martin Luther King that was taught to like third graders or something like that. And the simple act of showing white people oppressing Martin Luther King, which I mean, like white people treated Martin Luther King very badly. They killed him eventually. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
this is inescapable that like there's a lot of very bad treatment of Martin Luther King Jr. by white people, and you can't tell the story of his life without getting into that. But what some parents perceive that as is a violation of this law because to show white people oppressing black people was to imply that white people are bad, like fundamentally bad because of their race. And you don't have to say that, but like I'm sure the teacher didn't say that, or I hope the teacher didn't say that because that's not the lesson to take out of that the story of Martin Luther King Jr. But by presenting oppression, people have internalized that as a critique of their identity
Mm-hmm.
and a critique of them morally.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very telling that we can't even tell the history without some people feeling like we're attacking an identity broadly. And
And
all that
Mildred,
is to say, I think that that kind of proves that a story like this is helpful. Like,
mm-hmm.
To Kill a Mockingbird goes, for the most part, unchallenged by the kind of white people who push back against Martin Luther King's history, right? The pushback To Kill a Mockingbird gets is because it's not progressive enough for the basically. But a book like this, which doesn't have the same sort of centering of the white perspective, would be criticized from like that same perspective as like the Martin Luther King biography, right? When you like foreground the experiences of people of color and the oppression that they have faced, usually by white people, usually by people who are, wealthy or landowning in some way. Um, People perceive that as an attack against whiteness,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes it really difficult to teach texts like this, uh, which I think indicates that a text like this is really important to exist, even though it's 40 years old, and even though it's written for middle schoolers or things like that. Like if I taught this to my high schoolers, I don't know that I would get pushback, but I could imagine the pushback that I would
Mm-hmm.
get.
Yeah.
You were going to say something a second ago.
No, I was just gonna say that just thinking about this book was written in the 70s, and we're having all these conversations and seeing this now. Mildred Taylor speaks a lot about this, about why the story is important. And, some of the pushback that this book got when it was published is very different than what it would get now. But I just think it's important. I don't know, just kind of it's not even prophetic because she was seeing it happen in her day, but like she just speaks to a lot of these things that we're saying just in her forward about why the story is important. And it might make people uncomfortable. It might, but that is so important to know your history, even if it's uncomfortable. And so I appreciate that she is saying those things that we're seeing play out right now. Like we're not just talking about things in the past. We're talking about what's happening right in front of us.
Right, and that's what I mean. If you go to the law that I was just referring to in Tennessee, that's what they don't want you to talk about. They say that you can talk about in a historical context how groups have been oppressed in the past, but what makes people uncomfortable and what people don't want to like, and what this law, if you take it in aggregate, kind of precludes, is this idea that like oppression and racism and hierarchy in society are ongoing systemic issues rather than simply something we fixed in the past. And I think that it's worth talking about that, like, in 1977 when this was published, like that was less than 10 years after Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Right. Right.
That was not even 20 years after. It was like 12. Was it 12? Yeah, I guess 12 years after like the Civil Rights Act of 1965 was passed. Less than, it was like 5 years after like the kind of COINTELPRO surveillance of like the civil rights movement by the FBI, and frankly like the intentional sabotage of the civil rights movement by the FBI was uncovered, right? Like the stuff that she's talking about like the Jim Crow South, like at the time she was writing, it was barely history. Even though this is set in the 30s, obviously like decades before that, like a lot of those like social structures were legal until less than 20 years before this was written. And those social structures didn't go away once they became illegal, right? It takes a long time to work those things out of your societies, and sometimes your society never successfully works them out. We still have racial inequalities today. We still have things that are motivated by racism. We still have unequal outcomes in schools, unequal resources in schools that oftentimes fall along racial lines. And I think by setting this in the past, it maybe is making it a little bit sneakier or more palatable because you can view it as, well, that was the past. But a lot of these same things still happen. We live in a neighborhood that, is for Knoxville where we live, like the quote unquote like black part of town, right? I mean, Knoxville is not a very diverse place in terms of race, but like, for the city, this is like an area that has, for the past several decades been like considered like, where black people live. And what's happening is a lot of families are finding out that, they didn't, because they don't own the houses that they live in, because they've been renting from people, they don't have control over their future, right? As their rents rise, as gentrification happens, and so like this idea of like property being a proxy for racial inequality, like it still happens today, even if we're not sharecropping, we still have, issues with that. The black part of town can become the white part of town, if the landowners decide that it will become so, or at least the black part of town can become the quote unquote rich part of town if the landowners decide that it is so. And anyway.
So a lot to unpack here.
Lots to unpack.
So I definitely give this book a thumbs up.
I do too, as much as I was, I don't know if it sounded negative, but, as much as I was maybe saying it's not exactly my cup of ty for a book, it is like very good at the things it was trying to do, and I think it was good. So thumbs up for me as well.
And it did leave me really, I think I mentioned this, but I do want to read more about the Logan family, especially considering that she writes up until civil rights, and talks about the family moving to Toledo and all of that. So I think that's really exciting.
Yeah. So I guess that wraps up our conversation on Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Next time, we're going to be moving into the 80s, and we're going to be reading another book that Rebecca and I have, neither of us have read. We're going to be reading 1980s Newbery Medal winner called A Gathering of Days, A New England Girl's Journal by Joan Bloss. Is that how you pronounce her last name?
It looks good to me. One other little bit of trivia I will say about this book that we found out.
This Roll of Thunder?
Yeah. As we were researching, is that There was actually a television movie adaptation made of this in 1978 that has Morgan Freeman in it. So
You want to see a little baby Morgan Freeman? I don't know how much of a baby he is.
I don't know. We'll have to watch it.
I wonder
and
what
see.
role he plays.
We'll see if we can get it somewhere. But anyway, just if you're interested.
Yeah. So yeah, next time we'll be in the 80s reading A Gathering of Days, a New England Girls Journal. I don't know what that book's like. I've never heard of it, honestly, before you got it from the library. So fingers crossed on that being more exciting than the title. Maybe it'll pull an Upper Road slowly. And
Probably.
But anyway, so this has been the Newberry Chronicles. I keep forgetting to say this at the end of the episodes, but we've got an email address. Feel free to email us at newberrychronicles@gmail.com. Or is it the Newberry Chronicles? Regardless, feel free to email us. It is simply newberrychronicles@gmail.com. I just checked. We'd love to hear feedback. And yeah, that's it. So thanks for listening. This is now our longest episode yet. Just two white people talking about racism.
Yeah, you know
what the world needs.
Right. Need more white people talking about race. That's what I got to say.
I agree. And on that note, let's end. So thanks for listening, everybody. Bye.